Okay, the 14th lesson looks at the aims of the progressive movement. Again, I'm on my own here, but I know enough about this stuff, so you won't be let down. So, firstly, let's do a little bit of background, jumping right in. Um, there's a lot of people who confuse populism and progressivism, and they are two different things, so there are quite a few similarities. Now, what we really need to understand here is that progressivism comes out of economic prosperity. It's a nationwide movement as opposed to populism, which was sectional, particularly born amongst the farmers, largely in the Midwest and the South. It has rural strongholds, that is populism, and populism develops into a political party. Progressivism, on the other hand, is a nationwide thing, predominantly from the middle class, has pressure groups in the two main parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, but does not really form into a political party until 1912, anyhow. The famous newspaper journalist William Allen White claims that progressivism was a populist who shaved his whiskers, washed his shirt, and put on a derby hat. But progressivism is rooted in the middle class. So, unlike the earlier populist movement of struggling farmers and workers. And what does that mean for us? Well, when we understand the progressives, we have to focus in on what the middle class are. Okay, these are people who are white predominantly, and they're educated and they're intent on bettering society. What they really want to do is to save capitalism by curbing the worst abuses of the capitalist system. What plagues the middle class is the predominant fear, in many ways, that the capitalist system will come down around it, that the working class, who make up the overwhelming majority of the population, will take the system down. They were terrified of a workers' revolution. Okay, they were terrified of all of the sort of the social upheaval that they see around them. They saw women fighting for the right to vote. They saw religious women struggling to stamp out alcohol. They had, in many ways, um, won the middle class, that is, hard-earned gains, and they were very much keen to keep them. Therefore, with their privilege and their idealism, they're trying to uplift the poor. Anyhow, make a long story short, what are middle class values? Progressivism is not populism because it's a movement rooted in the middle class. And that's, again, a point I've made, I guess, 3 times now, but it's really important to remember that. It's begun by muckraking journalists feeding the literate middle class with information. Popular magazines like Collier's magazines provide a forum for writers to present their writing in a relatively sensationalist way. And perhaps as a result of their class status, their, let's say, unusually for the time, um, high levels of education and their influence, the progressives are also probably more successful in getting their reforms passed than any other group previous. Even so, we need to always remember that the progressives don't achieve all in which they had hoped. Nevertheless, by comparison to earlier movements that had almost no success whatsoever, the sort of the class status and say mm, created intelligence of education allows them to sort of move further than previous organizations had. So, how do we judge the success of the progressives? Really important to remember that it's a middle class movement. Therefore, what are middle class values? So, what are the things that they want? They want to increase the sort of the democratic influence of Americans. Therefore, attack corruption, fix the voting system so that that it's more democratic, that senators, for instance, are elected, that the abuses of local government, particularly that of party bosses who had, through corruption, run the inner cities, can get eliminated in order to help the poor. They wanted to focus on limiting the abuse of industrialization. The primary way to do this, in the eyes of the progressives, was getting the government to actually use the powers it had, such as enforcing things like the Sherman Antitrust Act. The third one is women's suffrage. Okay, this is predominantly for white women, of course, and that's the idea that women should get the rights to vote, that they are in fact equal citizens as defined in the Constitution, and to overturn earlier laws that said even though you're equal citizens, that doesn't extend to the right to vote. And of course, attack the worst abuses of urban squalor, motivated much by the muckraking journalism of people like Jacob Riis. They want to attack the living conditions in the inner cities, the tenements that we've talked about so much, and other sort of abuses such as urban prostitution, alcoholism, I suppose, falls into this as well. I'm not going to elaborate on all of these, as we'll sort of deal with them individually, but it's important to remember that the progressives have a range of concerns, ranging from social, political, to economic. Not all of them are addressed. In fact, a progressive can and does not have to be representative of all of these things. Progressives can have in some cases, a very broad range of concerns. In other cases, they're relatively focused on one thing and yet still identify as a progressive. So, as we said, it's not a national movement, it's a collection of people who have a bunch of similar ideas and start to put pressure on government in many different ways, largely again from the middle class. Let's deal with their economic aims first. So, what are their economic aims? Number one, the progressives will begin to speak out against the monopolization of industry. The idea that one company can come to dominate almost all of industry, such as Standard Oil, controlling more than 90% of all of the oil refining, drilling, production in all of the United States. Okay, they didn't really seek in this way a socialistic redistribution of wealth. They didn't want the means of production taken over. But what they wanted is the idea that because they thought the Gilded Age had put power in so few people's hands, it had actually gone against the cherished American ideal of democracy, equal opportunity, the ability for anyone to achieve the American dream. And as a result of one company or one small group of companies or an individual owning so much, it meant that other people couldn't compete, and therefore the American dream was being barred. They wanted a system which at least prevented the worst abuses of that. Okay, curbing the power and the ability for trusts to form is one good example. They felt effectively, yeah, that the monopolies ruined the free market. It led to a permanent underclass, it limited social mobility, and it also meant that people living in urban slums were hopeless to do anything about this. And of course, the great fear underlying this all is those people living in the urban slums would eventually choose violent revolution as an option, realizing very much that people do not, of course, resign themselves to their fate. Therefore, in order to protect the system, they needed to change it. Now, to do this, they wanted the government to take an active role in regulating business instead of being the very much hands off laissez faire. They thought that government should sort of mix itself within the economy. They thought that it needed to play a bigger role as a regulator. They wanted government to act as a protector of the citizens of the United States against the excesses and exploitation. Now, they wanted legislation on trade unions, hours of work, injury at work, insurance schemes. They wanted conservation of wetlands and natural resources. They wanted regulation against rigged prices, monopolies, dirty water. They wanted to change currency, of course, to help farmers away from the gold standard, more to sort of the bimetal currency, the unlimited coinage of silver. Additionally, they had social aims. Of course, those aims are varied, and in many cases, they actually conflict. But ultimately, at the root of it all is a desire for a better quality of life. Included are things such as the emancipation for women, that is, that women should achieve the right to vote, and progressive politics should support women in their desire to achieve equality in all facets of life. Welfare reforms, the idea that in the United States right now, if you fell down, not literally, but economically, i.e., you lost your job or you got injured at work, there was literally nothing that was there for you. Additionally, there were the problems in the inner city are exacerbated by this. The slums are full of people who are unemployed and have absolutely no way of earning income. Slums are full of people who've been injured at work and they have no way of getting back. And therefore, slums becomes literally a place of an incredible cycle of destitution in which people couldn't escape. The progressives are very much model their ideas on social work policy, such as Jane Addams in Chicago, who forms Hull House. Hull House is basically your first community organization, buildings and areas where people can go. They can learn trades and help each other out. And they wanted the government to sort of implement a community policy to help people out so that people aren't resigned to the fact that they'll never get a job. They can be retrained if needs be. They can, if they're injured at work and they can no longer do, thing X, i.e., I don't know, swing an axe, they can learn to do something else that can guarantee themselves an income. And a couple other things they wanted. Now, because let's just say very much a strict Protestant Christianity runs to the United States, they also focus on things like the evils of alcohol. They form things like the Anti-Saloon League, and these are groups actually largely led by women who concentrate on the manufacture and sale of alcohol as a cause of evil. Um, they will push for the prohibition in the sale and consumption of alcohol, which is something that will actually be achieved by 1919, not really before the First World War. Some people will focus on African American rights. In the North, this will come from particularly, okay? The fact that a lot of African Americans start to leave the South whenever the opportunity presents itself and go to the North in search of better jobs means that people in the North become more acquainted with the hardships of the South. Then black and whites will join together to try and improve the African American situation. The third thing that they have, of course, are political aims. Okay, and the political aims need to be broken up into about 4 or 5 different categories here. Actually, 4. The first political aim is a change of the Constitution. Some said that the Constitution needed to be changed to make it more suited to the, let's say, the late 19th, early 20th century. They wanted to see a change that would allow women to vote. They wanted that senators to be elected. I'll explain to you later on exactly how the United States government system works if you need. But bottom line is this. Senators, which are a very influential rung just below the president in the lawmaking process of the United States, were not elected. They were appointed by state legislatures. And state legislatures or state governments tended to be dominated by business interests. For instance, in Ohio, Standard Oil controlled almost the entire Ohio government. Therefore, the Ohio senators, 2 of them, each state gets 2, are appointed effectively by people who have the interests of Standard Oil in hand. Now, if the senators can veto laws made in the House of Representatives, the appointment of these senators are incredibly important. And in order to get progressive legislation through government, you need senators and people at the House of Representatives, in fact, all levels of government, who support your cause. So that was one thing they wanted. They wanted people to be able to vote directly for their senators. They wanted a federal income tax, which is something that needed to be written into the Constitution. They wanted people to pay tax, not necessarily, actually, they wanted people to pay tax based on their level of income. So the rich would pay more, the poor would pay less. But the only way up until this point the federal government raised money was through tariffs. And tariffs, of course, had hindered predominantly the farmers. So choosing income tax as a way to raise money was seen as a broader thing. Number one, it taxed the rich and made them pay their fair share in a sense. But also, too, it helped out the farmers because it meant that there was less of a emphasis placed on the need for high tariffs. The reform of the federal government. 2 broad ideas for reform. Number one, a more regulatory approach and an interventionist role in the economy, and that's sort of something we've touched on already. And they wanted to utilize the powers that it already had. We had the Sherman Antitrust Act. It had barely been used. The Sherman Antitrust Act had only been used in a small number of circumstances before Theodore Roosevelt comes to power. They want the government to actually employ it. In fact, many of the times the Sherman Antitrust Act had been used, it wasn't even used effectively, and almost nothing had happened to prevent the growth and spread of trust. Roosevelt will come to power, for instance, and sue a railroad trust and let effectively under the Sherman Antitrust Act, and wins a case in the Supreme Court which breaks up a trust which was fixing prices on the railroads. So they want the federal government to use that more, and that's actually something that happens to some degree. They would like a radical reform of the management of cities and states. Many cities, of course, are run by corrupt officials, the bosses, the mayors, the police, and they lacked any real sense of public duty. There's no accountability. Many faced in the inner cities increased taxes while not getting public services at all, or seeing that what little public services they had were actually deteriorating in quality or being taken away. The best examples of the corrupt bosses are Boss Tweed and Boss Platt from New York City. And they started to run this city, and they had run this city throughout the Gilded Age in a way to make personal profit for themselves. What the people wanted was a much more open and democratic system for electing mayors. Mayors effectively were, yes, elected, but the people who ran for them were corrupt, and the system of electing them was very, very corrupt. So what they've thought the best way to, let's just say, achieve reform in the cities is fix how the people who run government are elected. Reform of political parties. In the United States at this particular time, the two major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, were wide open to business influence. I had mentioned earlier that Rockefeller Standard Oil dominated the politics of Ohio and Pennsylvania. How they decided to reform political parties was to make the nomination of the candidates, okay, whether it be for local elections or for the president of the United States, open to everybody. Often at this time, it lay in the hands of a small group of businessmen who mixed business and politics to their advantage. They wanted to create what's known as the open primary. Okay, a primary election is an early stage of voting in which the whole electorate can choose a political party's candidate rather than having the candidate chosen for them by the elites of the party. So by having or instituting a primary system, they hope to get people who are more representative of the public's vision of change or need for change than those people who are nominated by the party elite, who happen to be the donors, who happen to be the ultra rich, who happen to be the people who want to influence politics for the advantage of business. Anyhow, you get the whole point. Last thing to conclude on the fact is that there were huge obstacles that stood in the way of them succeeding. It's really important to note we're always looking for nuance. The progressive era is and does usher in some pretty big change. However, compared to the overall aims, the progressives don't come close to meeting them, especially not all of them. There are lots and lots of reasons for it. Now, number one, the first reason is there is a hostile judiciary. Okay, the judiciary, the courts, they have huge power over progressive reforms. It could invalidate it if it wanted to. They could reinterpret important legislation to take the meaning of it away. The Supreme Court, for instance, had radically redefined the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1768, which empowered the federal government to overturn state laws that violated citizens' rights. This was originally passed by Republicans in Congress to protect African Americans in the South. But by the 1880s, the 14th Amendment was cited by the court as the basis of their defense of liberty of contract. In other words, that the courts interpreted the 14th Amendment to mean not that we need to protect people, that effectively people have a choice to employ citizens' rights in a way that, let's just say, well, it's open to interpretation. How do I best describe this? Let me think. Okay, let's put it this way. Liberty of contract means people are free to enter into a contract that goes against the rules set for it by government. Okay, so let's just say the government imposes a minimum wage or imposes a law that says black people need to be treated as same as white people. In liberty of contract, in the case of, let's say, a sharecropper in the United States in the South, if the black person enters into a contract with the white person and that contract is inherently discriminatory against that black person, the 14th Amendment can be superseded. So basically, the judiciary sort of takes the laws that are meant to protect people and allows for the manipulation of it. Okay, we'll see that in a number of examples, and that will become more clear. The second thing is diluting influence of the elites. You get Wilson, Roosevelt, and Henry Stinson being some of the more prominent politicians of the progressive era. These people position themselves, of course, to get elected as champions of the progressive cause because progressivism is popular. And what we find, though, is when they get into office, they don't necessarily take the progressive flag and run with it. They're willing to make some compromises, do, let's say, progressivism light, in order to keep the elites happy on one side who are donating to them and funding their political parties, while on the other hand, give the workers and the people just enough to say that they're making some change. And as a result, the progressive era policies, they're not implemented as they wanted. They're very much diluted. Okay. A couple other points: economic, social, and regional racial divisions. There are, of course, a huge variety of regional divisions in the United States. In the South, you get things like the Jim Crow laws. Okay, one of the lowest points in American race relations history, happening at the same time as the progressive era. You get black people being lynched by the thousands across the South and the Midwest. And this is happening at a time when people are supposed to be emancipating the blacks. So we have to contend that the progressivism is diluted by racism. It's also diluted by the fact that um, some people, like Woodrow Wilson, for instance, the most famous progressive, he reintroduces segregation among federal employees, ensuring things like the army is segregated in the United States. Okay. Additionally, Woodrow Wilson will put huge restrictions on immigration and movement. Okay. When many progressive reformers are championing, let's just say, open immigration, a more accepting and tolerant society, he is actively trying to prevent what he notes as Mongol races of poor, illiterate immigrants from reproducing at a rate that they would take over from, let's just say, the true American population of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So we see that there's a massive dichotomy, that the progressives aren't necessarily as socially liberal as we think they would be. And lastly, there's a lack of organization. I mentioned very much off the top, this is not really, until 1912, a political party. They are ideas adopted by members of government who represent both the Republicans and the Democrats. And they borrow these ideas from, say, the middle classes and the good majority of the people. And they take what's politically convenient for them, okay, or symbolically necessary to try and make, or rather prevent bigger change. What they don't want to see, what a lot of people don't want to see in the United States, is massive, sweeping, revolutionary change. So what happens in the progressive movement is, yes, they make successful movements forward, but what happens is the fact that those movements forwards are often just tokens, just enough to keep people from rebelling. And as such, with the progressive era, in many cases, only sees some incremental change. Okay. Not only that, the progressives have all sorts of contradictory motives. At one point, you have Wilson becoming incredibly liberal in many ways, particularly in his policies against the abuses of big business. But at the same time, his outlook towards immigration is incredibly contradictory with the liberalism of one side. And what we see is really a truism of human nature. Not all people are black and white. We don't have, you are a progressive or you are not a progressive. You have all sorts of shades of gray. And the progressive movement does exist in this sort of gray area. So it's really important to understand the nuance of why and what is provided when evaluating whether or not the progressives, an individual like Woodrow Wilson, or the progressives as a movement throughout the early part of the 20th century are actually successful whatsoever.